War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to Episode 5, The Law of War. Current events have forced my hand to delve into a complicated topic which can and has served as a career of study. Initially, it flies in the face of our original definition of war, that of sovereign entities. A sovereign has no limitations on his actions. And yet, back to the Hammurabi Code, there have been rules to war. The Tanakh, the Hebrew word for the Old Testament, likewise listed strict prohibitions against certain actions. Of course, the ultimate sovereign for the ancient Jewish nation was the Lord himself, so he had the authority, I guess. Islam, born in battle, has several rules set by Allah for the conduct of the Islamic armies in the Quran. Thomas Aquinas introduced not necessarily laws, but rather concepts to judge the lawfulness under Christian tenets, both the cause of the war, the Cassus Belli, as well as the conduct during war, the Jus Ad Bellum. There were permissible times to go to war, and there were permissible actions, up to, obviously, the killing of humans, ordinarily the ultimate sin. Recently, a new concept has been introduced of post-Jus Bellum, judging the conduct of the peace, how the vanquished should be treated, a fair conversation in light of World War II being at least somewhat a continuation of World War I. Within all of these conversations, because of the inherent brutality of armed conflict, there are hypocrisies and contradictions. In the age of terrorism, the idea of lawfare, as a means to undermine the political and grand strategy support for conflict, has become both a ways and means of defeating a nation-state fighting against irregular forces. The law of war could be its own podcast. Maybe it should be. I am not that guy, both for lack of training and a personal belief that the law of war is a convenient mechanism for winners to punish losers. But it has unquestionably emerged as an asymmetric means to attack countries that believe in the law of war by entities that reject them entirely. The law of war is ultimately irrelevant to truly sovereign entities, and ignored regularly by combatants even today, often most notably by those who cry the loudest about them. But the mission of the podcast is to educate, and an understanding of both the legalistic and philosophic basis for the law of war is essential to understanding conflicts today, in the past, and unquestionably in the future. Even the most basic of educations will have introduced the Geneva Convention. It is actually a plural conventions, with several iterations of international accords all bearing the name. Most of what people call the Geneva Conventions is actually the Hague Conventions. Both the Hague and Geneva served host to conferences agreeing to a set of rules to protect civilians and combatants because of their traditional status as neutral cities in neutral countries. Small countries invariably seek neutrality, itself a concept largely consisting of hoping big boy countries defend them against other big boy countries. And while both Hague, Belgium, and Geneva, Switzerland enjoy the title, by geographic considerations, only Geneva actually gets to enjoy the status of neutral without other armies defending them. Belgium has constantly been a battlefield for other parties, owing to its flat terrain and unfortunate position sharing a border with both France and Germany. It is simply impossible to go over all the conventions and agreements to regulate warfare in 15 minutes. So I'll focus on explaining the general concepts and highlight some specific aspects that are especially valid currently and in the foreseeable future. As a general rule, the two main Hague Conventions focus on conduct in war vis-a-vis belligerents. So, prohibitions on chemical warfare, ironically, are from the Hague Conventions, first signed prior to World War I. You're about to see a common thread on agreements being violated. Such laws against the use of unnecessarily cruel weapons and munitions stem mostly from the two main Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. Expanding bullets are banned. It is important to note the United States, while not a signatory to the Hague Conventions, does, as a matter of national policy, generally adhere to them. The Geneva Conventions, generally, but not entirely, focus on the protection of those not taking part in hostilities. The protection of civilians and prisoners of war are covered mostly by the various Geneva Conventions. Not just individuals are covered, but particularly in later conventions, the protection of certain buildings, hospitals, religious buildings, and those with cultural significance. It is now an almost annual occurrence that those countries with effectively no military come up with a new international agreement to ban a weapon they don't possess. Bans against cluster munitions, landmines, herbicides, blinding laser weapons have all been created and variously ignored in the past 50 years. So Latin supplants Greek as the language of warfare when it comes to the law, and a few key terms to understand. Jus in bello, justice in war. These are those actions during a conflict which are and are not permissible. The Hague and Geneva Conventions are almost entirely jus in bello conventions. Jus Ad Bellum, literally right to war, refers to the conditions under which states may resort to war or to the use of armed force in general. These conditions may be called the Cassus Belli or cause for war. Traditionally, the use of a declaration of war would formally list the Cassus Belli before engaging in conflict as a justification for international approval for their actions. Perhaps the most famous Cassus Belli is the Declaration of Independence. Here, the Founding Fathers painstakingly listed all the affronts under which we suffered, which justified their claim of independence and taking arms against Great Britain. This is partially why Congress is mandated to declare war, not merely to authorize the action as representatives of the people, but also to formally memorialize as an act of Congress why the nation went to war. The UN, itself with no inherent sovereignty, gives 3 acceptable reasons to go to war: self-defense, the defense of an ally, and not surprisingly, when the UN says to go to war. But self-defense is a broadly defined construct. Going back to the instruments of national power, if you attack a nation's economy, you have attacked the nation itself. Can an attack on one instrument of power be justification for use of another? Of course, when you are sovereign, you can do whatever you want and justify it as you see fit. This desire to appease international agencies and both domestic and foreign populations is part of the diplomatic and communicative instruments of power. If one party is particularly strong militarily but weak diplomatically, their enemy will almost certainly seek to undermine their support. Both military power and diplomatic power stem from economic power. You can buy friends just as easily. The United States, despite our immense wealth, seems to do an incredibly poor job with maintaining international support, even with billions of dollars spread throughout the world. And this goes back to information as a lever of power. The lone superpower status the United States still nominally enjoys leads weaker nations, even those considered allies, to seek to undermine the United States' policy objectives through unified opposition to the general idea of American power, if not necessarily the actual use of that power at the time. But I digress. Ordinarily, the populations affected by war are broken down into 2 broad categories: belligerents and protected persons. Civilians, those not taking part in hostilities, are, of course, considered protected persons. Those belligerents who are hors de combat, out of the fight, are also protected persons. This includes those who have been wounded, shot down, shipwrecked, or have surrendered. The law is clear-cut, and the application not so much. Take the example of the surrendering soldier. If a person defending a hill is actively killing the attackers and runs out of ammunition and at the last moment throws his hands up, by the law of warfare, his surrender must be respected. In reality, that coupon expired. De facto, the opportunity to surrender is generally open at the beginning of the fight. Once that fight has commenced, surrender becomes increasingly difficult. Likewise with wounded enemy. In a firefight, the fighting does not stop when someone is wounded, and wounded people can still fight. So in the attack, once someone is down, you make sure they stay down. However, after the fight is over, then the wounded are afforded protection. The line between combat reality and war crime is crooked, faded, and unevenly drawn. What constitutes a civilian has become more complicated as well. A lawful combatant is easily defined. They are commanded by a person responsible for his subordinates. They have to have a fixed, distinctive emblem recognized at a distance, ordinarily a uniform. They must carry their arms openly and conduct their operations in accordance with laws and customs of war. But what about people who aren't truly civilians and aren't lawful combatants? According to current international conventions, They remain civilians until tried by a competent court and afforded civilian rights to mount a defense. The term unlawful combatant is not accepted internationally, but armed, organized individuals who fail to meet the requirements of lawful combatants, particularly because of their refusal, as opposed to inability, to wear a uniform, are not always recognized as civilians. This gray area of status is personified in the current conflict in Gaza. Hamas has stated every Arab killed in Gaza is a civilian. By international convention, this is accurate. However, that status is, in my opinion, and the opinions of others, an abuse of the term. Current international laws and conventions on the status of combatants have not been updated since just after World War II. Non-state actors have used this deficiency in the international law to directly violate other international laws. Specifically, the prohibition against using human shields and the prohibition against using protected areas for military purposes. Hospitals are explicitly protected targets, unless used for military purposes, according to Article 19 of the Geneva Convention. Hamas apparently used hospitals as their military headquarters, and they have, allegedly, refused to allow civilians to evacuate combat zones. The taking of hostages is explicitly a war crime. In the latest bout of Arab-Israeli conflict, Hamas took both Israeli hostages as well as using their own civilians as hostages. These are just a few examples of the complexity fighting an enemy that, despite having uniforms, refuses to wear them in combat. It is with this complexity in mind that we address the general rules by which wars and the conduct within them are judged for their legality. First, war must be declared by, and I quote, the proper authority, which returns us to the concept of sovereignty. But if a non-proper authority engages in armed conflict, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to war, so not particularly useful. Second, there must be a just cause, which returns to self-defense, defense of allies, and because the UN says so. But what about threats of war? If someone threatens violence, can you defend against that with a preemptive attack? Well, of course you can. You are sovereign. You can do whatever you want. And some people will attack you for it, but they would probably attack you regardless. Third, there must be a possibility of success. To wage war, fully knowing it to be futile, is considered a crime. Of course, how one can judge an impossibility with all the uncertainty surrounding conflict renders this principle largely a fig leaf of fictionality that sounds good in conference rooms and I'm sure is used to try losers in future wars. And fourth, it must be a last resort. Armed conflict can only be used when all other options of diplomacy have been exhausted. Again, the level of effort involved here is all in the eyes of the beholder. As you look at these four principles, you can see how people quip the only crime in war is losing. A sovereign state that wins a war will never suffer for having violated these principles, and likewise, a sovereign state that loses, despite having violated none of them, will suffer as if they had. There's another concept tied into this last principle, and that is of proportionality. The violence used should match the political intent of the warring entity, and at the tactical level, the amount of force should not exceed the tactical benefit of the victory. An example would be if, while at sea, a belligerent fired upon, but failed to damage, a fishing boat. This is unquestionably an act of war, and the right of self-defense applies. But some might frown upon letting 150 nukes fly and wiping the attacker off the face of the earth. In another example, if an enemy is engaging you with a single rifle from a church steeple, you could completely destroy the church and steeple. If 300 people were in the church, however, the proportionality would be questionable if the attacker knew 300 people were in it. It is the intent of the act that determines proportionality, not the outcome, which is also why it is a crime to engage in hostilities with hostages or human shields in front of you. Should that lone sniper surrender, after having used 300 people as human shields, he could be tried as a war criminal and not afforded standard prisoner of war protection. This is all but a taste of the deep, bitter, and at times infuriating subject of the law of war. The permutations of how the law of war can be manipulated, abused, and ignored are intuitively endless. I am sure I missed about 1 million, and we can return later. Please let me know which law surprised you, or which one you wanted to know more about that I missed, and join me next week as we discuss the domains of war. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.